Our speaker today is High Speck. If you don't know High Speck, I'm sorry. If you do, you're blessed. And after our presentation today of the Millennium Park, everyone will know High Speck. High, won't you please?
Thank you.
Okay, my friend.
Thanks, Art. Can you hear me? Excuse me. Can you hear me back there? Will you talk to yourselves for a few moments? We have to make some adjustments. We're going to turn the lights down, right? And I have to switch this cord. So hang on a second. Okay, hopefully it works. You want to turn those lights off, please? Thank you very much. Good morning. It's nice to be with you, especially since I'm a member of this organization. It's an honor to be with you today. And Art said we'd have a terrific crowd for me, but then I realized it's pizza day. Just a little my background. I'm a retired school teacher. I taught for 40 years in the Chicago Public Schools, teaching in every grade from Head Start through graduate school. And back in 1970, I even taught a course on Channel 11, Introduction to Data Processing. Excuse me. These programs that I do are a result of my volunteer work with the Chicago Architecture Foundation. When I retired, I was looking for something interesting to do, so I joined the Architecture Foundation. I was trained as a docent, which is a fancy name for a tour guide. And now I do tours in Chicago Loop and Millennium Park, and also on the Chicago River. How many people have taken that tour on the Chicago River? Whew, that's terrific. Well, you can come back again, because over the winter what we do is we move the buildings around. And it's completely different. Millennium Park is one of my favorite tours because it contains a lot of information about interesting people who mostly designed the park and also contributed the money to make the park happen. I start off with this painting, which is probably the finest painting at the Art Institute of Chicago. Anybody know the name of it? Sunday Afternoon on the Grand Jatte by, what was the artist? Seurat. And what's the style of painting called? Pointillism. Millions of dots of paint are joined together and they form this magnificent picture. And I like to think that this is the inspiration for Millennium Park. Millennium Park is right next to the Art Institute on Michigan Avenue, and if you go just north to Monroe Street, you'll hit Millennium Park, and there it is. And the wonderful thing about Millennium Park, there isn't another city in the world that would have 25 acres in the middle of the city where you could put a new park in. It is the finest park developed, or the finest public space developed probably in the last 50 years. And I have my little pointer here. And this wonderful site is because we have Lake Michigan on the east, of course. Now the pointer doesn't work. But you know that the street down below is Monroe Street, and this is Michigan Avenue, and that's Randolph Street. 25 acres of magnificent park. That's probably the #1 tourist attraction in Chicago. Now, why is it there? Why is Chicago here? Chicago is here because of the little dinky river called the Chicago River. And if you go down the North Branch, which is right next to my condominium, incidentally, and if you go down the North Branch, you'll hit the main branch of the Chicago River, and it attaches to one of the largest lakes in the United States, which of course is, thank you, Lake Michigan, right? Lake Michigan, one of the 5 Great Lakes. And Chicago is here because we have a magnificent location. What do they say in business? The secret of success is location, location, location. You can travel down the Chicago River into Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan attaches to Lake Huron, and over here is Lake Erie, the Erie Canal, the Hudson River, and there's the Atlantic Ocean. You could travel all the ways to Europe from Chicago by boat. Chicago at one time was the largest seaport in the United States, more than New York and Philadelphia and Charleston and New Orleans combined. So that's why we're here. And when they incorporated Chicago in 1837, the federal government said this area here should be forever open, free, and clear for the use of the people of Chicago. Another major event in Chicago's history happened at 137 DeKoven Street, which is now Taylor and Jefferson Street. It happened on October 8th of 1871. Who knows what happened on that day? The Great Fire. In a wooden barn behind their wooden house, Mrs. O'Leary was milking one of their 5 cows that she used as, she was on the dole, and she had a little milk route. So she milked that cow, and the story is that the cow kicked over the lantern and started a great big fire that spread across the city of Chicago. A big wind blew in, I believe from Glenview, incidentally, and spread the fire across the city of Chicago, and people fled across the bridge. And 300 people lost their lives, 100,000 people were homeless, and 17,000 buildings were destroyed. But it really was a blessing in disguise because most of the buildings were wooden, and how do you get a chance to start all over and build a new city? And that's what happened to Chicago. Much of the debris was shoved into Lake Michigan, and Grant Park and eventually Millennium Park was built on top of it. This is the burn zone. This is Mrs. O'Leary's house. It did not burn. The barn burned, and this big wind blew in and jumped over the Chicago River about here, jumped over there, and wound up, stopped burning when it reached the city limits. The city limits in those days was Fullerton Avenue, where the Lincoln Park Zoo was located. It destroyed a third of the city. This is State and Madison Street about 2 weeks after the fire, and they started to salvage as many bricks as they could and as many beams, iron beams that they had, and they started to rebuild the city. What didn't the fire burn? Water tower is very important, but it didn't burn the river, and it didn't burn the lake, and Chicago still had its wonderful location. And immediately people came from all over the world to rebuild the city. This is a picture that I took from the top of the Willis Tower, formerly called the Sears Tower, the 103rd floor. This is Taylor Street. This is Jefferson Street. On the site of Mrs. O'Leary's house and barn is this tall building. And what's the Fire Academy? That's exactly right. Isn't it ironic that they trained Chicago's firemen on the very spot where the Chicago fire started? And if you walk down Jefferson Street to this building here, you will find Chicago's most famous deli, which is Manny's Deli. Just north of DeKoven Street, in fact, in front of the Fire Academy, there's this wonderful sculpture by Egon Weiner called Pillar of Fire. But Manny's is right down the street. And Manny's played an important role in the absolving Mrs. O'Leary of any guilt in the fire. Mrs. O'Leary was blamed for the fire because she was Irish and she was Catholic, and there was great prejudice against both of those groups in those days. But here's the famous Norman Rockwell painting of Mrs. O'Leary milking her cow. And Mrs. O'Leary was vilified, and they were looking for a scapegoat. They even wrote this little song about her. Late one night when we were all in bed, Mrs. O'Leary lit a lantern in the shed. Her cow kicked it over, then winked her eye and said, altogether, there'll be a hot time in the old town tonight. Even Wanzer Dairy got on the bandwagon and said if Mrs. O'Leary had only had her milk delivered, we would never have the Chicago fire. Thank God. On October 8th of 1997, the Chicago City Council, that great seat of wisdom, held a board of inquiry and took testimony absolving Mrs. O'Leary of any guilt in the starting of the Chicago fire. The key piece of evidence was this. A witness was found who testified at the very moment of the fire, Mrs. O'Leary was in Manny's Deli eating a corned beef sandwich. That's the actual corned beef sandwich. And this guy is named Gino. You ever go in there? He's the one that slices corned beef for the last 30 years. Everybody was ecstatic. Even the cows were ecstatic. Well, what's the importance of this? Well, it started Chicago rebuilding and also shoved much of the debris into Lake Michigan, and on which Grant Park and some of Millennium Park is created. Millennium Park, one of the greatest public spaces built in the last half century, is the vision of the three wise men. And the three wise men are Daniel Burnham, the Dean of Chicago Architects, Montgomery Ward, who invented the mail order business, and Richard M. Daley, the last mayor before the prior mayor. Daniel Burnham had the largest architectural firm in the world back in 1893 when he was made the head of the World's Fair. It was the most successful World's Fair up to that period of time. 28 million people came to Chicago and found out that Chicago had recovered from the fire. He was a great architect, and he built the Santa Fe building, which is on the corner of Jackson and Michigan. And he had offices at the top of the building because architects like to have offices in the buildings that they create so the tenants would know that the building wasn't going to fall down because the architect had an office there. He was hired by the commercial club at no money, incidentally. He volunteered his service to make the great plan of Chicago, and it was adopted in 1909. The important thing that he said, besides redesigning the city, he said the lakefront by right belongs to the people. There isn't another city in the world that has an ocean sitting on their doorstep. So take advantage of that. Make parks and beaches and piers and marinas and things of that nature for the enjoyment of the people. Aaron Montgomery Ward came to Chicago in 1870 to work as a traveling salesman. And he saw that the farmers weren't getting the goods that they need at a reasonable price. So he came up with the idea of the catalog. And he said, satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. He would ship the goods by rail or by mail, and goods like this. This buggy was only $53. Where are you going to get a buggy like this for $53? How about a commode, solid oak, for $2.50? How about this contraption, only $1? And if you wore this thing, you were bound to get a marriage proposal, and he would sell you a golden wedding ring for $1 a pennyweight. He was very successful. Chicago became the mail order capital of the world. Besides Montgomery Ward, who else did we have? Sears. Give me some more. Butler Brothers, Spiegels, Alden's, all came here to Chicago because it's the center of the mail order business. This is a picture taken in 1894. There was a strike at the Pullman Standard Car Company, Palace Car, and soldiers were called in to put down the strike, and they bivouacked right on Michigan Avenue. These are some of the tents. And notice right next to it is the railroad. This is the Illinois Central Railroad that had been given the right-of-way to put a coffer dam in Lake Michigan and then lay tracks after they pumped out the water. And they laid them right down the center of Chicago, which was a great boon to the Illinois Central. When Montgomery Ward looked out his window on Michigan Avenue, this is what he saw. He saw this wonderful lake, and you can't get to it. Have you ever been to Cleveland? Cleveland has factories and apartment buildings on the lakefront. There is no access to Lake Erie. Well, Montgomery Ward didn't want that. His office was in the John M. Smith showroom on Michigan Avenue. Do you remember John M. What was it, Smith or Smythe? I don't remember. Well, he was right here. He looked out. Here's the Illinois Central blocking access to Lake Michigan, and this is what he was confronted with. Besides that, on the open space, they had carnivals, they had garbage dumps, they had armories, anything that the people couldn't use. They couldn't get to Lake Michigan. So he started to sue the city. He said the lakefront should be forever open, clear, and free. He sued them 4 times. He won 4 lawsuits and got a law passed saying that you could not build on the lakefront from 12th Street up to Randolph Street. This picture is taken from the stairs of the Field Museum, Chicago History Museum, and notice there is no buildings except the Art Institute up till Randolph Street. And that's the reason that we have the space that we need for both Grand Park and Millennium Park. The third wise man was Richard M. Daley. And the story is that Richard Daley was in this building. Here's Montgomery Ward's building, incidentally. He was in this building, 30 North Michigan, on the 8th floor, visiting his dentist, Dr. James Merlo, getting his teeth cleaned. He looks out the window, and what does he see? He sees the Illinois Central tracks, a little strip of Grand Park, and a huge parking lot that the freight business had been abandoned, and now they rented it as a parking lot. In fact, you could see my car there. I worked down the street on Lake Street, and I used to park there because it was the cheapest place around. And so he looks out the window and he says, this is terrible. How can we have our visitors come in here and this is our doorstep, our stoop, the welcome there. We've got to do something about it. And they proposed putting a bridge over the entire parking lot area, 25 acres. Now, there's no other city that would have 25 vacant acres available for a new park. And ironically, here's Montgomery Ward looking out the window also, and they all agreed that we needed a new park for the Millennium, the year 2000. So they went to Skidmore, Owings & Barrow, our leading architectural firm, and they came up with a plan, and they needed money. So they got a hold of John Bryan, who was the former CEO of Sara Lee Corporation, and they asked him to raise some money. Well, he was on the board of the Lyric, and he was on the board of the Art Institute of Chicago. He knew wealthy people, and he knew how to get money out of them, and he raised about $250 million. Now, the first project they had was a garden. The motto of Chicago is Urbs in Horto, meaning city in a garden. So they allocated about 4 acres for a garden on the southeast corner of the park. And it's named the Lurie Garden after the major contributor to the park, Anne and Robert Lurie Foundation. How did Robert Lurie make all of his money? Well, he went to the University of Michigan, and at the University of Michigan they were pledging for the same fraternity with Sam Zell. I think you've heard of him. And Sam Zell is a dynamo. Robert Lurie was a very conservative, calm person. They made a perfect marriage there. They were going, Sam was going to be a lawyer, and Robert was going to be an engineer. And while they were in school, they decided to go in the business of cleaning student apartments. If you've ever had one of your children at college, you know their apartments always need cleaning. And they made a lot of money, and they bought property in Ann Arbor, and then they came to Chicago and formed a real estate corporation, became one of the largest landlords in the world. Robert, it seemed to me, was very shy. He lived in Lincoln Park in an apartment, and one day he was standing by the elevator with his laundry basket going down to the laundry room. And the elevator comes down, and it opens up, and this beautiful lady is inside. And he was sort of dumbfounded. Her name was Anne LaSalle, a pediatric intensive care nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital. And he looks at her and he said, "Do you know how to separate the whites from the colors?" Which is a great line, isn't it? For a shy guy. And she said, "Of course." And they went down to the laundry room and did their laundry, and a romance ensued, and they got married, and they had 6 children. Sadly, in 1990, Robert Lurie contracted colon cancer, and he passed away, leaving her with the 6 children and an estate of $475 million. Since that time, she spends most of her time giving the money away. Now, Millennium Park is really a bridge, and we had a bridge before. This is the old building of the Art Institute. And remember, there was a bridge here where they had the Harding Museum, where they had armor, medieval armor. Well, I don't know what it is today, but there is a bridge that's across the railroad into the new wing, a new section. So they were going to build a bridge of 25 acres. So they hired these 3 people to design the garden. Catherine Gustafson, who was an internationally known landscape architect, Piet Oudolf, who is a Dutchman who's an expert in plants, and Robert Israel, a lighting designer on Broadway and in Hollywood. And they all got together and they came up with this design. This is the Lurie Garden. It has a wooden pathway down the center called the seam, a dark area called the dark plate with dark plants and trees, a light area with bright plants showing the emergence of the Chicago after the fire, and it's surrounded by a hedge of 200 trees called the shoulder hedge, named after the poem by Carl Sandburg, Hog Butcher to the World, the City of the Big Shoulders. And so that's the garden, and this is the way it looks today. There's the wooden path. And then there's a stream, which I think echoes Chicago River or Lake Michigan. And this wall is the coffer dam that was built by the Illinois Central Railroad to keep the water out, and then they pumped it all out and laid their tracks there. And Catherine Gustafson used this design in London, in Hyde Park, at the Princess Diana Fountain. So next time you go there, you'll see that it looks exactly like the Lurie Garden. Well, this is how it looked in 2004. They laid irrigation pipes down like the Israeli system, and they planted 25,000 individual plantings, 250 varieties of plants. And it's done by professional horticulturists and volunteers who come from all over Chicago to tend to the garden. This is how it looks today. It's just like a Garden of Eden in the middle of Chicago. And look at those buildings behind. Many of them, this one is remodeled into a condominium. This one is a new one. It's called Heritage on the Park. All there because of the view of Millennium Park. And back here is Trump Tower, where all the expensive condos have a view of Millennium Park. And these are some of the flowers that you'll find in bloom today, in fact. And underneath, the railroad is still going to Randolph Street Station, and there's a new parking lot in that area also. And here is Anne Lurie, and she recently gave $100 million for the creation of the Anne and Robert Lurie Children's Hospital. Now, another feature of the park is the Grand Park bandshell. First bandshell was built in 1931, and it was a wooden grand shell. It was opposite of the Field Museum. This was falling apart, so in 1978 they built another one on Columbus Drive and Jackson, which still stands today, still in use today. It was a big hit. The bandshell was built because in 1931 was Depression, and the Musicians Union used their influence to get them to offer free concerts at the bandshell. Musicians had no place to work, and this was an outlet for them. Plus, this was before television and movies and other entertainment, and people used to flock there to hear the band perform. They even had guest artists, and this is Lily Pons and her husband Andre Castellanets, 1937. 250,000 people came to hear them. This is, can you recognize, a very tall pianist? Van Cliburn. When he won the Tchaikovsky Prize, he came and he drew something like 150,000. This is an example of the crowds that they get at the pavilion. Probably 200,000 people came to hear the 1812 Overture when they had cannons and everything to play. Well, they wanted a new music pavilion. So who was the #1 architect working today? Frank Gehry, internationally known. In a recent poll in Vanity Fair magazine, he was voted the greatest architect of the last 50 years by fellow architects, not laymen, by architects who know the business. So he's just brilliant guy. He designed buildings like this. This is the Disney Concert Hall. Anybody been in there? Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. This is a museum in St. Paul, Minnesota. He even does an office building. This is an office building in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And you know what he calls this? He calls this Fred and Ginger. Well, this is his masterpiece. This is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Bilbao was a Spanish town in the Basque Country, down on its heels. And this museum turned the whole place around. It became a tourist attraction. How many people have been to Bilbao? Isn't that amazing? Look at that. Well, it's just a magnificent building. So the committee governing Millennium Park wanted Frank Gehry to do a building similar to this. And Frank Gehry says, I've done a lot of these buildings. It's getting redundant. I'd rather not. And so he declined. So they were looking for other architects and other sources for money, and they went to Cindy Pritzker, the wife of J. Pritzker, the Pritzker family, one of the wealthiest families in the country. And they asked her if she would sponsor a pavilion that would name it after her husband, her deceased husband. And she said, well, let me look at your plans. She looked at the plans and she didn't care for them. And she said, why don't we get Frank Gehry? He said, well, we tried, but he declined. And he said, he's too busy. He said, let me talk to him. Let me call him up. So she says, Frank, do you remember a few years ago that we awarded you the Pritzker Architecture Prize, which is the Nobel Prize of Architecture? And you got that wonderful gold medal and $100,000. Do you remember that, Frank? And he said, what do you want, Cindy? And he agreed to design a music pavilion for Millennium Park. And so they allocate, I think it's about 10 acres there. I don't know the exact measurements, but that's the area just north of the garden. And this was the rendering. He, of course, had his signature flying buttresses, flying proscenium arch here with stainless steel. And in front of that are 4,000 seats, permanent seats. And in the back, there was a lawn of 3 football fields in size. This holds 4, this holds 7, that's 11, and you can stick around, 5,000, 10,000 around the perimeter. For the sound, he designed a trellis. Instead of having pylons blocking people's views, he designed a trellis, and from the trellis they hang over 100 speakers. So the sound in the first